In Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the setting of the story is constantly described. The cold, grimy city of St. Petersburg, the dilapidated mess of Raskolnikov's apartment, and the poverty and unemployment that Raskolnikov both faces and is surrounded by. Throughout the book, we see the way these factors impact Raskolnikov's daily life and thoughts, but how much do they really impact him? When he finally commits the murder of Alyona Ivanovna and Lizaveta Ivanovna, his physical environment seems to be deteriorating along with his own health. The similarities between the environment that Raskolnikov lived in and his mental health and actions made me wonder if there was a connection between the environment that a person lives in and the likeliness of them committing a crime. Using current studies about the impact of cities, poverty, and mental health on one's likelihood to commit a crime, connections appear between what Raskolnikov experienced and the crimes he committed. In this video, I will explore environmental factors that make a person more likely to commit a crime and how those factors both fit into Raskolnikov's life and crimes, as well as deviate. Cities are typically more dangerous than rural areas. In America in the 1990s, cities had 79% more violent crime and 300% more violence than rural areas. But why are there so many more people committing crimes in cities? A study published by the University of Chicago highlighted some reasons that more violent crime occurred in cities, such as increased anonymity and lower arrest probability. All these attributes connect to Raskolnikov's experience of living in a city and his experience of committing the murder. Raskolnikov lived in the city of St. Petersburg, which in the 1860s was a city of about 539,000 residents and growing rapidly. He lived alone, far from his family, who resided in a rural village, and on numerous occasions Raskolnikov experiences the coldness, isolation, and invisibility that living in a city can often bring. In St. Petersburg, Raskolnikov is nobody. He wanders aimlessly around the city, clearly mentally unstable, muttering to himself, and yet we almost never see him run into anyone who knows or cares enough to help. Yes, there are people he knows throughout his community, but unlike a small town, those people are spread few and far among the strangers of the city. This lack of community means that Raskolnikov has no one keeping him accountable on a social level, regardless of the law. The study from UChicago states, quote, informal community sanctions may be as important as formal legal sanctions in eliminating crime. Urban anonymity makes it hard to enforce sanctions, end quote. With no one except his critical and anxious internal voice to guide him and keep him accountable to social norms, Raskolnikov's only guiding principle to not commit the crime was the law, but even that is complicated by city living. In a city, the probability of arrest is lower. In 2020 in the US, the police solved just over half of all homicides. While exact statistics for murders solved in St. Petersburg in the 1860s aren't known, crime was a rising issue in the city, and it seems unlikely that the rate of murders solved would be higher than that of a country with access to modern technology. So while the likelihood that Raskolnikov's murder would be solved wasn't small, it wasn't enough that he would certainly be punished for committing the crime. The anonymous nature of a city also contributed to this. After the murder, Raskolnikov was able to slip out of the building. After the fact, Razumikin comments that the murderer, also known as Raskolnikov, quote, may have been seen, but he wasn't noticed. There were always plenty of people about, end quote. With no accountability to community sanctions because of the anonymity of city life and little accountability to legal sanctions due to a low probability of arrest, there was little keeping Raskolnikov from succumbing to his desire of murdering Ivanovna. The impact of poverty on crime, specifically violent crime like the one Raskolnikov commits, is often disputed. Some studies argue that poverty by itself doesn't lead to crime, but rather inequality between the rich and poor. A study of over 35 countries found a positive correlation between economic inequality and crime. Their reasoning was that, quote, inequality breeds social tensions as the less well-off feel dispossessed when compared to wealthier people. The feeling of disadvantage and unfairness leads the poor to seek compensation and satisfaction by all means. However, others dispute this and argue that the impact of poverty on crime is more complex. It's less about inequality and more about both the desperation that poverty creates and the risk factors that are associated with poverty that then go on to affect one's likelihood of committing a crime. A study done on public housing projects in the 80s and 90s showed that concentrated poverty resulted in higher rates of crime. The rate of violent crime committed by the children of families who had been moved from large housing projects into neighborhoods with lower poverty rates was lower than those who remained in the concentrated public housing. Additionally, they found that the closing of large-scale public housing in Chicago resulted in an overall reduction of violent crime across the city. Additionally, poverty is connected to crime because it increases risk factors which increase crime. People experiencing poverty have an increased risk of developing mental health conditions, experiencing high levels of stress, and having less parental involvement in children's upbringing. All these factors have the possibility of increasing one's likelihood of committing a crime. So while the specific connections that poverty has to crime isn't completely clear, it is clear that it's connected in some way. Using crime and punishment as a case study, we see that although poverty might not directly shape Raskolnikov's crime, it does shape his life. The clothes he wears, which end up being a source of embarrassment and anxiety for him, the small apartment he calls home, which, quote, resembles a cupboard more than it did a room, end quote, and the general instability of his life are all a result of the poverty he lives in. Although poverty does affect the overall life and environment of Raskolnikov, it doesn't seem to affect his actual reason for committing the crime, as many studies seem to imply poverty does. Although he does owe a debt to Ivanovna, he doesn't ever retrieve it, showing it clearly couldn't have been the sole purpose of the murder. Rather, Raskolnikov's reasons for murdering Ivanovna deviate from what many of the studies show. It wasn't solely because of inequality or desperation, but also driven by Raskolnikov's own perceived superiority and rejection of society's norms. This shows how, while poverty may impact crime, it isn't the whole story, especially in the case of Raskolnikov. While mental health isn't technically an environmental factor, the way that it is related to living in cities and poverty make it important to connect, especially since Raskolnikov exhibits mental illness. People living in cities are at a higher risk for developing severe mental illness. This is because of a myriad of factors, including the ones we already discussed, like poverty and social isolation. Looking at all these factors holistically, the way they are all interconnected and both cause and are the result of one another becomes clear. According to the American Psychological Association, people with severe mental illness are slightly more likely to commit crimes than those without. A study of 34,653 people showed that, quote, 2.9% of people with severe mental illness committed violent acts between 2 and 4 years following the study's baseline, compared with 0.8% of people with no serious mental illness or substance use disorder, end quote. This means people with severe mental illness are about 3.5 times more likely to commit violent acts than those without. However, once again, given the connections between mental health, poverty, cities, and a myriad of other factors, it isn't totally clear whether mental illness is actually the real issue. In fact, one study found that, quote, when neighborhoods are unsafe, poor, and high in crime, violence is an equally likely outcome whether a person has a mental illness or not, end quote. So how do Raskolnikov's actions in Crime and Punishment tie into any of this? It's clear throughout the book that he struggles with some kind of mental illness. We see him talking to himself, having hallucinations, and generally being